Good evening, everyone. I can take this off for a minute. It's as our speakers, when we opened Holbein and had our first lecture in the auditorium, as they said at the time, it feels sort of wonderful to have people in the room and being here. So I'm very pleased you've come, and we are very much looking forward. Holbein Capturing Character will be on view until May the 22nd, but I hope you'll come and see it again and again. If I thanked all of the supporters and trustees and foundations that helped bring this show to the Morgan, I would be eating into Xavier's time quite drastically. So I just want to acknowledge that we have had phenomenal support for the exhibition, and I think it has been a gift to New York at this moment when we feel some renewal. The wonderful catalogue in which two of our curators, John McQuillan and Austere Maculate, contributed, is being reprinted. It will be, it's not, sadly we can't buy it at the moment, but you can put orders in. It will be coming back to the Morgan Bookshop. I also want to mention that there are some related programs. A screening of A Man for All Seasons with Paul Schofield, which I'm very excited about, and perhaps more seriously, on May the 6th, an international symposium organized by our Drawing Center, which will bring many specialists to the Morgan, and I encourage you to come to that as well. I ran into a friend this evening as we were coming into the exhibition, and I said, Xavier Salomon is speaking. Do you know him? Have you heard him? And she looked at me as if I was crazy and said, well, of course. Before I introduce Xavier's academic and curatorial accomplishments, he is known to everyone with his colleague Aimee Ng for the exceptionally successful Cocktails with the Curator. Which has won a Webby and has been viewed over 1.7 million times. But let me introduce Xavier, the curator and the scholar, who is also, I think, known to many people here. All of his art history degrees were taken at the Courtauld. He came to work as a Mellon Fellow at the Frick Collection, where I got to know him. He has held curatorial posts at the Met, at the Dulwich Picture Gallery. He has been the chief curator and now deputy director at the Frick Collection for some years, and he has been responsible with Aimee Ng for the tremendous reinstallation at Met Breuer and now Frick Breuer, and of course is guiding the return to 1 East 70th Street. His accomplishments as a scholar, a writer, are extraordinary. There are no fewer than 20 books and catalogues that he has organized. Just thinking of Veronese in London, a marvelous show some years ago, but also there are as many as 50 articles and essays. He's extremely productive. He's also been the co-author and I think the co-genitor of the diptych series at the Frick Collection, and he's written on Fragonard, on Rembrandt, and, of course, on Sir Thomas More. And that will be his topic this evening. He is a member of the Projects Committee and a trustee of Save Venice, and in 2018 he was named Cavaliere dell'Ordine della Stella d'Italia by the Italian government in recognition of his achievements for Italian art. Without any more ado, Xavier, we welcome you to speak on Holbein and Thomas More, an intimate portrait. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Colin, for the very generous and kind introduction. Sorry, everyone, I'm not going to be drinking a cocktail, but it's just water. Thank you to everyone at the Morgan. Thank you to Austere and John for inviting me. And congratulations on a really, really marvelous exhibition. I'm thrilled to see Thomas More in such great company here at the Morgan, with so many old and new friends of the sitter, as we will see in a second. Between September 2021 and January 2022, as part of a project entitled Living Histories, Queer Views and Old Masters, the Israeli artist Doron Langberg exhibited his work, Lover, at Frick Madison, next to Hans Holbein's the Younger's Sir Thomas More. As different as the two works may appear at first sight, they share a number of similarities. Langberg portrayed his sitter seated, only wearing a pair of dark blue shorts decorated with small polka dots, surrounded by diverse types of textiles, pillows, pieces of cloth of different colors. Langberg's lover is engrossed in reading a text, his hand conspicuously in the foreground, prominently displaying a wedding ring. The sitter is absorbed in the act of reading. The world around him seems to disappear, as he is so directly concentrated in the mental exercise shaped by the text in front of him. He does not engage with the artist, who seems to capture an intimate moment unbeknown to the sitter. The man represented in Lover is also oblivious to the fact that other people, the viewers standing in front of the painting, the image, are looking at him. Langberg painted Lover for the Living Histories project in 2021, while Hans Holbein portrayed Sir Thomas More almost exactly 500 years before, in 1527. Moving back in time, we found ourselves in a similar position. More is shown wearing a black cap and a black fur-trimmed coat. Below it, the white, crisp collar of his shirt and the voluminous red velvet sleeves of his doublet can be seen over the shirt. Behind him, a heavy green gilt-fringed curtain is partly open with a red rope against the plain grey wall. His proper right arm rests gently over a wooden plane, probably a table or part of a bench, which is inscribed in carved Roman numerals at the lower left. You can just about see it here. You can see it obviously better in the painting itself. And what is inscribed there is the date, 1527, the date of the painting's execution. His hands are close to one another, a large gold ring with a bloodstone on his left index, an apparently blank letter clasped in his right hand. Over the generous fur trim of the coat, prominently displayed, is a large gold chain. More's hair is dark, but his budding beard shows signs of grey. Holbein's portrait is an extraordinary exercise in focus. While the painter lavished his attention on every detail of More's skin and to each item of clothing, More possesses an intensity in his gaze and a determination in his pose that betrays a slightly uneasy feeling in posing for an artist. Both paintings by Holbein and Langberg are the result of intimate encounters between an artist and a sitter. In both works, the sitter is observed and his image fixed in a sudden moment to which the painter is a witness, setting it through paint for posterity. But there are also obviously significant differences between these two works. Both were created by men and represent men, but while Langberg's work implies a level of desire between artist and sitter, Holbein's portrait is not concerned with physical longing of any kind. What I would like to discuss this evening, however, is the role of Holbein's portrait of More as an intimate image, a friendship portrait within a very specific network of European humanists and scholars in the 16th century. The temporary presence of Holbein's portrait of More on loan from the Frick collection here to the Morgan Library and Museum allows me to revisit my research on the portrait, which was carried out a few years ago in view of writing a small book on the painting as part of this series of books published by the Frick and known as Frick Diptychs. Written and accompanied by a beautiful essay by Dame Hilary Mantel, the book was published in 2018, and the material I'm presenting here this evening can also be found in it. I should start by acknowledging that, as we will see, the original patron and circumstances of Holbein's creation of this portrait of More are unknown. The circumstances around the creation of the portrait and its purpose still remain shrouded in mystery. The whereabouts of Holbein's portrait for almost a century since its creation are unknown. It is, however, worth exploring, to begin with, the painting's subsequent history. In 1631, Arthur Hopton wrote to the Earl of Arundel, "The picture of Sir Thomas More is in Rome, in the Cardinal Crescenzio's house, and is not to be had for any price." The Holbein portrait must have left England, if not immediately after being painted, at least by the end of the 16th century. A copy of the portrait, now at the National Portrait Gallery in London, which you see on the right, is a faithful copy of the Holbein original. The outline of every part of the composition fits perfectly, demonstrating that the artist responsible for the copy could have not produced it without having access directly to Holbein's original. The materials with which the painting was created, however, a limewood panel and red preparation over chalk ground, established that the copy was not made in England, but instead somewhere either in Central Europe, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, or near the Alps, France, possibly even northern Italy. The existence of this copy, which dates stylistically to the late 16th or early 17th century, allows us to envision that Holbein portraits left England either during More's own lifetime or soon after his death, and reached either Central Europe or France or northern Italy. When Arthur Hopton described the portrait of More in Cardinal Pierpaolo Crescenzi's collection in Rome, he was describing Holbein's original. An inventory was taken of the paintings in the Crescenzi Palace next to the Pantheon in Rome on the 10th of February 1698, after the death of Marquis Giovanni Battista Crescenzi Jr., nephew of Cardinal Pierpaolo. The inventory mentions the portrait of More in the collection. I quote, "A painting in a worm-eaten ebony frame representing Thomas More on a panel made out of 4 pieces of the height of 3 palmi." Even though the artist of this work is not mentioned, so there is no mention of Holbein in the inventory, 2 clues make it certain that the painting in the Crescenzi Palace in 1698 was Holbein's portrait now in the Frick collection. 3 Roman palmi are the exact equivalent in height of the height of the painting, 75 centimeters. And out of all the known versions of Thomas More's portrait on panel, and there are many, the Frick one is the only one that could have been described, and in fact was described until recently, as being made out of 4 pieces, because of the 2 vertical cracks in the 2 panels. The fact that 3 breaks, one, a central one, which was caused by the panel's construction, two pieces of wood, and 2 by damage, so each of the 2 panels is cracked vertically. The damages were visible in the 17th century, and this is also witnessed by another source, by Filippo Baldinucci's Notizie dei Professori del Disegno, which was published in 1681, in which Baldinucci describes the portrait of More by Holbein in the collection of the Crescenzi family in Rome. According to Baldinucci, I quote again, "Another marvelous portrait of Thomas More was painted by Hans Holbein and had been displayed in the gallery of Henry VIII, in a room where the portraits of the most celebrated men from antiquity and modern times were kept. On the day following the death of Sir Thomas, the awful Anne Boleyn set eyes on it and pronounced these words, 'Alas, it seems that he still lives on this panel.' Hence, having had the painting removed from the wall, with her own hands, she threw it out of one of the elevated windows of the palace. And it was believed that it was thanks to the work of divine providence that that worthy image, although rather damaged by the impetuous blow, was preserved, and it was eventually brought to Rome and was housed in the palace of the Crescenzi, where it has been preserved until today." Now, we don't know if Anne Boleyn really threw the painting out of the window, but it's a very romantic idea of why the damage to the panel occurred. But it is true that, as I say, that both panels, both pieces of wood are cracked, which means the painting is incredibly fragile, and one of the many reasons why it's not usually lent, and it being here at the Morgan is actually the first time it ever leaves the Frick collection since it was acquired in 1912. And that is not just to do with Anne Boleyn. Hopton's letter of 1631, Baldinucci's description from the 1680s, and the 1698 inventory therefore established that Holbein's Sir Thomas More was on display for most of the 17th century in the Crescenzi Palace in Rome. It is actually possible that Holbein's painting reached the Crescenzi collection as early as the end of the 16th century. On the 26th of November 1585, the French cardinal Mathieu Contrel, known in Italy as Matteo Contarelli, the owner of the famous Contarelli Chapel in San Luigi dei Francesi, which was later decorated with 3 great canvases by Caravaggio, drafted his will in Rome a day before dying. In the will, the cardinal nominated Virgilio Crescenzi as his executor and sole heir. The will was followed a few days later, on December 3rd, by the inventory of the cardinal's paintings, and among them there was a painting of Thomas More. The description in this inventory is too vague to securely identify this portrait with Holbein's, but it is likely that this was the painting that was later owned by the Crescenzi family. Virgilio, Cardinal Quantrell's heir, was Cardinal Pierpaolo Crescenzi's father. If the Holbein portrait belonged to Quantrell, this could explain how the painting passed from Northern Europe, maybe from France, to Rome. In any case, the Holbein portrait remained in Rome in the Crescenzi Palace, in the shadow of the Pantheon, from the 17th century all the way to the 19th, for almost 2 centuries and through 6 generations of the aristocratic family. And the palace is this palace just to the side of the Pantheon. And it's extraordinary to imagine that the painting would have been there next to the Pantheon for 200 years. Almost unknown. I mean, very few sources in the 17th and 18th century refer to it in Rome. A later drawing by Henry Bone, an English artist, after the Holbein, now in the National Portrait Gallery in London, lists the painting as belonging to a certain Mr. Bonelli and gives 2 dates at the bottom, down here, May 1809, which seems to have been crossed out, and July 1813. And here you have Mr. Bonelli's name. Bone had also painted a miniature after the Holbein portrait, now in the Venerable English College in Rome, which is dated 1811, and on the back of which is an inscription reporting that the original portrait belonged to a certain Angelo Bonelli from Todi. It turns out that the last member of the Crescenzi family, Violante, the only daughter of Marquis Marcello, the last Crescenzi owner of the portrait, had married, in fact, in the mid-18th century, Marcantonio Bonelli, and their son, Pio Camillo Bonelli, is likely to have inherited the Holbein portrait and to have been an ancestor of this Angelo Bonelli from Todi. By 1858, the portrait was in London, belonging to the dealer Ferrer, who claimed the painting had been brought to England by Bonelli himself. The painting later belonged to the bibliophile Henry Huth in London since at least 1864. And after Huth's death in 1878, the portrait passed to his son, Edward. In 1897, the art historian Bernard Berenson tried to convince the American collector, Isabella Stewart Gardner, to purchase the Holbein portrait from Huth. He considered the painting perhaps the very finest portrait by Holbein in existence, and he urged Gardner, "You must beg, borrow, steal, do anything, but don't lose this opportunity of getting a masterpiece by one of the few greatest masters in existence." By July of that year, however, Berenson had determined that the painting was not, after all, available. Bad news about the Holbein. Money simply can't get it now. He had heard that Huth was planning to bequeath the portrait to the National Gallery in London. Henry Clay Frick had not been successful with his initial interest in Holbein. In 1909, he had failed to buy the portrait of Christina of Denmark, Duchess of Milan, which had been offered for sale by the Duke of Norfolk. The potential sale abroad had generated an outcry of the public opinion, and the National Gallery had succeeded in saving the painting for the nation. And here you see the painting on the left, and on the right, a caricature from that time, not very subtle, showing Uncle Sam with a bag of money trying to drag Christine of Denmark away from the UK. Now, the interesting thing about this transaction is that Frick believed to have acquired the painting because the deadline for the National Gallery to raise the money, the funds for it, passed without the National Gallery having raised the funds. And Frick knew that they had reached, I think, half of the amount by the deadline. So he actually celebrated the purchase of the painting, only to discover that it was a bank holiday Monday. So the deadline was extended by a day, and an anonymous great lady had paid the rest of the money for the painting to reach the National Gallery. Now, I haven't been able to do any research in the National Gallery about this, but I've recently been wondering if this great lady, this anonymous lady that no one ever mentions, was in fact the Queen, Queen Alexandra, who of course was from Denmark. So the idea that she may have given the money to the National Gallery to buy the Christine of Denmark, who wasn't exactly an ancestor, but was related in some way, may be the case. But I'm not sure if we will ever be able to prove that. But it's very strange within the National Gallery's history that someone just came out of nowhere paying a substantial amount for the time, and of course making the British public very happy and Frick much less happy. Where Gardner and Berenson failed, however, Frick succeeded. In 1910, negotiations started with Edward Huth to acquire the portrait of More, sort of a consolation prize for the Christine of Denmark. The painting was obtained, and through the dealer's firm Knoedler and Company, Frick bought the Holbein in January 1912 for $55,000. Between the late 16th century and Frick's purchase in 1912, the history of Holbein's Thomas More is fairly clear. However, we need to go back to the 1520s and before to try and understand the context around the painting's creation. Hans Holbein the Younger, the hero of the exhibition here at the Morgan, was born in the imperial city of Augsburg around 1497-98. His father, Hans Holbein the Elder, was also a painter. It is likely that Hans studied the first rudiments of painting with his father and with his older brother, Ambrosius, before moving to Basel to study with another local painter, Hans Herbst. Between 1515 and 1526, the young Holbein was based in Basel for more than a decade. In these years, he was at work on a series of frescoes for facades of houses of wealthy Swiss patrons. Holbein's paintings from the first half of his career spanned different formats and subjects, from large decorative cycles to altarpieces and portraits and designs for prints. In 1519, Holbein entered the Guild of Painters in Basel. In the same year, he signed and dated this portrait, one of the masterpieces from his Basel years. Bonifacius Amerbach came from a family of intellectuals and had studied in Freiburg and Avignon. In 1525, he became professor of Roman law at the University of Basel. When Holbein portrayed him, he was still a student and already moving in the intellectual circles of the Swiss city. Amerbach's portrait is accompanied by a Latin inscription composed by the sitter, which translates in English, "Although only a painted likeness, I am not inferior to the living face. I am instead the counterpart of my master, and distinguished by accurate lines. Just as he completes 3 intervals, each lasting 8 years, that is a very convoluted way to say he's 24 years old, this work of art diligently renders his true character." Hans Holbein painted Bonifacius Amerbach on the 14th of October, 1519. The date memorializes Amerbach's 24th birthday, and the inscription appears painted on a wooden panel nailed to a tree. The patterned shirt and fur-trimmed coat worn by the young Bonifacius witness his wealth, while the inscription denotes him as an intellectual versed in Latin. Set against a blue sky, outdoors, with snowy mountains barely visible in the background, Amerbach is handsome and elegant, absorbedly gazing out of the picture plane. Holbein elegantly portrays him with a tree branch, almost Japanese in its gracefulness, carefully placed behind him, and each hair of the man's beard is painstakingly rendered. And of course, in many ways, this is a precursor of the Thomas More portrait. In 1521, the Dutch humanist Desiderius Erasmus moved to Basel. Born in Rotterdam in 1466, as a prolific writer and intellectual, he traveled across Europe, settling in Paris, Venice, London, and Louvain before moving to the Swiss city. 10 years before moving to Basel, Erasmus had published one of his most celebrated works, The Praise of Folly, and had subsequently produced a Greek version of the New Testament in 1516. Both books, as most of Erasmus's works, between 230 to 235 editions, were printed in Basel by the publisher Johann Froben. Froben had taken over in 1507 the printing house of Johannes Amerbach, Bonifacius's father, and had quickly become the most important publisher in Basel and Erasmus's favorite. And there is a very beautiful roundel by Holbein showing Froben in the exhibition. Erasmus's move to Switzerland was in part linked to the presence of his publisher there. In the first years in Basel, between 1521 and 23, it seems that Erasmus even lived in Froben's house. Holbein quickly moved in Erasmus's and Froben's circles in Basel. For example, a copy of the 1515 edition of The Praise of Folly, belonging to another humanist, was illustrated with vivid marginal drawings by Hans and Ambrosius Holbein. In the mid-1520s, Holbein painted a number of portraits of Erasmus. Here you see the one now at the Louvre in Paris. And in June 1523, Erasmus sent 2 of them, for example, as gifts to friends in England. By the end of the decade, the image of the humanist Erasmus was closely associated with Holbein. On December 18th, 1526, Sir Thomas More wrote from London to Erasmus after Holbein's first arrival in England. Your painter, my dear Erasmus, is a wonderful artist, but I'm afraid he may not find England such fertile and fruitful ground as he had hoped. Sir Thomas More was a decade younger than Erasmus and 2 decades older than Holbein. He was born most likely on February 4th, 1478 in London. His father was a judge in the Court of Common Pleas and later in the Court of the King's Bench. The More family came from a solid mercantile London background. His grandparents were wealthy bakers and brewers. Most of Thomas's youth was lived against the background of the War of the Roses, up to its dramatic conclusion with the death of King Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth, and the subsequent coronation of the first Tudor king, Henry VII. As a young boy, More studied in London at St. Anthony's School, where, over a period of 5 years, he learned Latin. He subsequently entered the exalted household of John Morton, the Archbishop of Canterbury, at Lambeth Palace. Morton was also Lord Chancellor of England at the time and one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. He remained a fundamental figure in More's education and a man he emulated for most of his life. In the autumn of 1492, More enrolled at Oxford University, which he left, age 16, to follow in his father's footsteps to study law at New Inn. On February 12, 1496, 2 years later, soon after his 18th birthday, Thomas entered Lincoln's Inn, where he continued in his pursuit of law studies. As a young man, More moved in the literary circles of humanists and scholars in London. He met many of them, who became lifelong friends. In the summer of 1499, More met Erasmus for the first time, when the Dutch humanist visited London and stayed there until the beginning of 1500. Writing about More in this period, Erasmus portrayed their friendship in writing. We talk of letters till we fall asleep. Our dreams are dreams of letters, and literature awakens us to begin the new day. Many of More's interests coincided with Erasmus's own: a profound love of Greek letters, the comprehensive study of theology, and the practice of devotion. It was around this time that More became associated with the Charterhouse of London, and he probably spent up to 4 years living in the guest quarters of the monastery, practicing his studies alongside prayer and fasting. After years of legal studies and religious meditation, Thomas More entered the arena of public life in the early 1500s. In 1504, he was elected for the first time as a member of parliament, and at the beginning of the following year, he married Jane Colt. The couple had 3 daughters, Margaret, Elizabeth, and Cecily, and a son, John. Soon after Jane's death in 1511, More married his second wife, Alice Middleton. The family was established in a large house in the centre of London. There they were joined by visiting friends and guests. Erasmus, for example, stayed with the More household during his visit to London in 1505. He famously described More at the time as omnium orarum, which has been traditionally translated as a man for all seasons. Soon after the two men became friends, More started rapidly ascending the slippery ladder of social fortune. In 1505, he traveled for the first time outside of England and visited Paris and Louvain. 10 years later, in the spring of 1515, he went on a diplomatic mission to France and Flanders, to Bruges, Tournai, and Antwerp. By this date, More had firmly entered royal service. In April 1509, Henry VII was succeeded by his son, Henry VIII, and More quickly entered the king's graces. And of course, you see here Henry VIII in probably the most beautiful portrait of him by Holbein in the Thyssen Museum in Madrid, of course, from a few years later. They're not exactly contemporary, these two portraits. In the autumn of 1516, More joined the King's Council, and during the summer of 1517, he left England once again on a diplomatic mission to Calais. He rapidly became the King's second secretary, and the list of new and more prominent positions swiftly followed. Privy Councillor in 1518, Under Treasurer of the Exchequer in 1521, Speaker of the House of Commons in 1523, Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster in 1525. In 1521, the king knighted him. Years later, when William Roper wrote the first biography of Thomas More, he explained how close Sir Thomas had become in these years to the king, who visited More's new large house in Chelsea. Roper was More's son-in-law, and he lived closely to his wife's family and probably witnessed the scenes such as the one he described in the biography. And I'm quoting here from Roper. And for the pleasure he, the king, Henry VIII, that he took, in his company, in More's company, his grace would suddenly sometimes come home to his house at Chelsea to be merry with him, whither on a time unlooked for, he came to dinner with him and to him. And after dinner, in a fair garden of his, he walked with him, the king, by the space of an hour, holding his arm about his neck. More himself described his life in the first pages of his most celebrated literary and philosophical book, Utopia, around that time. And More writes, "Most of my day is taken up by legal affairs. So at one moment I'm pleading a case, at another I'm hearing one, then I'm settling a dispute, and at another handing down a judgment. At the same time, visits must be paid to somebody out of official obligation, and to someone else on business matters. Almost the whole day I'm out dealing with others. And what's left I devote to my family, which leaves just nothing for myself, that is, for writing. Naturally, when I get home, I have to talk with my wife and chatter with the children, as well as speak to the servants. All this activity I count as part of my duty, since it has to be done, and so it does unless you want to be a stranger in your own house. Between all these activities that I've described, the days, the months, and the years slip by." The two most famous literary works by Erasmus and More were inextricably linked. In 1509, Erasmus began writing his Praise of Folly, which was dedicated to his friend Thomas More. The book was in part composed while Erasmus visited More in London and stayed in his house in the summer of that year. The dedication of the book was a celebration of the two scholars' friendship. In it, Erasmus illustrated that I have always enjoyed my memories of you when we have been parted from each other, as much as your company when we are together. And I swear that nothing has brought me more pleasure in life than companionship like yours. The book was first published in 1511 and followed by a number of subsequent editions. The original Latin title of the book was Moriae Encomium, a play on the Greek word for folly, moria, and its assonance with More's own surname. Erasmus himself pointed this out in the dedication. In the first place, it was your own family name of More, which is as near to the Greek word for folly, moria, as you are far from it, in fact. And everyone agrees that you couldn't be further removed. In the author's own words, this was, I quote again from Erasmus, a jeu d'esprit, because you always take such delight in jokes of this kind. That is, if I don't flatter myself, jokes which aren't lacking in learning and wit. More was known for his particular drollness, and in 1515 he wrote his own satirical work during his diplomatic mission to Flanders, while visiting the humanist Peter Gillis in Antwerp. The book was first published in 1516 in Louvain. Its full title was On the Best State of a Commonwealth and on the New Island of Utopia, a truly golden handbook no less beneficial than entertaining. But it quickly became known as simply Utopia. The word utopia was actually invented by More, and it was a play again on Greek, and it had the double meaning of a good place and no place. The book is set in Antwerp, where the author, More, and Gillis meet the fictional character of Raphael Hytlodeus. Hytlodeus is a traveler and one who has visited the distant island of Utopia. The portrayal of the island and its inhabitants is a veiled revisitation of England as an ideal island, shrouded in irony and satire. The lives of Hans Holbein, Desiderius Erasmus, and Thomas More converged around 1526 to 27. Holbein had already been interested in seeking new work prospects outside of Basel. In 1517, while More was working on his manuscript of Utopia, while on his diplomatic mission in Antwerp, and while Holbein was at work on frescoes for a house in Lucerne, in Switzerland, an apparently insignificant action had taken place. A monk named Martin Luther had nailed a piece of paper on a door of a palace church of the German town of Wittenberg. What seemed like an irrelevant action of a disgruntled monk at the time was to send waves across the Western world and was to deeply transform European history. It was the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Unbeknown to both Holbein and More, this chain of events was to drastically alter both of their lives. Iconoclasm had begun to sweep through the German world and was reaching Switzerland and Basel, and the city was affected by it. Holbein, already in 1523 to 24, in part because of this, had been seeking patronage outside of Switzerland. He traveled to France, trying to secure commissions from King Francis I. In August 1526, Erasmus wrote to Peter Gillis in Antwerp, Holbein is on his way to England to scrape some angels together. Holbein reached London in the autumn of 1526 and most likely settled in More's house in Chelsea. Holbein remained in England for almost 2 years until 1528. While living with the More family at Chelsea, the artist took the opportunity to sketch various members of the household, and certainly more drawings must have existed. The survival of a large number of Holbein's stupendous portrait drawings testifies that it was a common practice for him to draw the features of a sitter before transferring them to a panel. During this first English period, it seemed that Holbein clearly preferred to create black and colored drawings in chalk on unprimed paper, and his sheets relating to More's family were all in this technique. At least 7 drawings of heads were produced in Chelsea, presumably towards the end of 1526 or in early 1527, and they're all now in the British Royal Collection at Windsor Castle. 3 generations of the More family were portrayed by Holbein. Sir Thomas's aging father, Sir John, on the left, is shown wearing a similar outfit to his sons, with a black cap and a fur-trimmed coat. Sir Thomas's only son, on the right, also his youngest child, John More the Younger, was born in 1508 and named after his grandfather. Holbein drew him immersed in reading a book. The lower part of the drawing is barely sketched in, but forcefully rendered, and John's striped black jacket with its voluminous sleeves gives the impression of a young, moneyed and stylish man. All three of More's daughters were likely to have been portrayed also by Holbein in drawings, but unfortunately the sheet showing More's first and favorite daughter, Margaret, does not survive. However, two drawings present Elizabeth and Cecily. Elizabeth, on the left, was born in 1506 and married in 1525 William Dauncey, Knight of the Body and Privy Councillor of Henry VIII. Cecily, who was only a year younger than Elizabeth and a year older than John, was also married in 1525, actually in a double ceremony with her sister and brother-in-law, to Giles, son of Sir John Heron, the treasurer to the chamber of Henry VIII. The More family was an expanded one, and Sir Thomas also had wards and foster children, as well as his own. Anne Cressiker, on the left, was the daughter of Edward Cressiker of Bamborough, and when her father died in 1512, soon after her birth, she was taken into the More household. By 1527, she had become betrothed to John More the Younger, and the couple was married in 1529. Margaret Giggs, on the right, was More's adopted daughter. She was born in the same year as John, 1508, and around 1530 she married her tutor, the court physician John Clement. More himself was, of course, the subject of one of the wonderful drawings by Holbein, where he appears in three-quarter pose, looking to his right, enveloped in brown fur and wearing a black cap. Thomas More, his father, his son, his three daughters, two adopted daughters, together with another two figures, More's second wife, Alice, and More's fool, Henry Pattinson, appear in another drawing by Holbein from the same period, which is now in the museum in Basel. It is immediately apparent that the heads of each figure in this drawing corresponds more or less exactly with the individual sheets at Windsor. This drawing is directly related to the most extraordinary painting Holbein created in England in 1527, a very large canvas with life-size figures which was destroyed, unfortunately, in a fire at Cromerish Castle in the Czech Republic in 1752. The scene is set inside More's house in Chelsea, and we can assume that Holbein faithfully depicted a room in the building with its wooden paneling, windows, and curtains. A few objects, a dish, a ewer, and a flask, appear on the dresser to the left, while a candle, another ewer, and books are resting on the window ledge to the right. At the center, hanging over a large curtain, is a clock, as if to mark the passing of time among three generations of the More family. The drawing is highly finished and was most likely a presentation drawing for the patron before Holbein began to paint the large canvas. Sir Thomas is sitting at the center of the composition, wearing his gold chain of office and surrounded by his family. He is placed between his father and his son. Sir John, also seated, nervously clasping his hands as if uncomfortable with the act of being portrayed. John the Younger, standing and reading, is to the side. And on the left are Elizabeth Dauncey, standing in profile, a book under her proper right arm, and Margaret Giggs, gently leaning towards Sir John while pointing to a small book. Between Sir John and Sir Thomas, Holbein placed Anne Cressiker, on the verge of becoming More's daughter-in-law. It is as if Thomas is placed between the past, Sir John, and the future, John the Younger, of his family, but also between the two people, Anne and John, that would guarantee the continuation of the More family surname. At the extreme right, near the window, is Lady Alice, kneeling at a prie-dieu and engrossed in reading another book. In front of her are two of the other daughters, Margaret on the right and Cecily on the left, sitting on the floor, also holding books and rosary beads. Behind them is the fool Henry Pattinson, standing and looking remarkably like King Henry VIII in his pose. Each character in the drawing is identified, and these are later inscriptions, and the age of each is given in the text. A few annotations in Holbein's own hand, however, demonstrate that this was also a preparatory drawing, notwithstanding its high degree of finish. The painter added a pile of books on the floor in the middle of the composition, here and here. A lute near the clock, up there. And inserted on the right, Lady Alice's pet monkey. The candlestick near the window has been crossed out, And Holbein also wrote instructions in German so that More's wife should be shown sitting and not kneeling. It is unclear if these changes were implemented in the final painting, but it seems likely that they reflect a decision matured after conversations between patron and painter at the time of the commission. And of course, because the painting, the final painting is lost, we don't know if that was the case. The painting must have been popular in England, and a number of copies of it exist, but all with varying degrees of changes and additions by the various copists, so none of them is probably an exact copy. Most of them seem to have belonged, interestingly enough, to descendants of the More family. This copy, which is now at Nostell Priory, was painted around 1590, and it belonged to the Roper family, descendants of William Roper and Margaret More, which were living at Well Hall. While another version, dated 1593, and now in the National Portrait Gallery in London, belonged to Sir Thomas's grandson, Thomas More II, the son of John the Younger and Anne Cressiker. We do not know how faithful these copies, and especially the Nostell Priory one, are to the original. But it seems that some of the changes indicated in the drawing were taken into account. For example, Lady Alice is shown sitting with her monkey. Elizabeth Dauncey and Margaret Giggs have been inverted in their position, and the head of Margaret is much closer to the one in the Windsor drawing. It is likely that the large family portrait was commissioned by More to celebrate his 50th birthday in 1527. The family group canvas was a unique and exceptional work. No portrait on this scale was produced, as far as we know, for non-royal families north of the Alps before then. The scene may reflect an evening reading in More's household, or more likely, their devotional practices. William Roper recorded evenings in the More household. As Sir Thomas's custom was daily, if he were at home, besides his private prayers, with his children to say the 7 psalms, litany, and suffrages following. So was his guise nightly before he went to bed, with his wife, children, and household, to go to his chapel and there, upon their knees, ordinarily say certain psalms and collects with them. The Frick portrait also is dated 1527. The same exact year as the large family painting. In pose, the portrait is almost identical to More's images in the Windsor drawing and in the Basil family sheet. The relationship between the Frick portrait and the More family painting is impossible to establish because of the unfortunate loss of the large original canvas. It is clear that both were executed at the same time and based on the series of drawings at Windsor, but it is impossible to establish if one predated the other. It is likely that the actual size of Sir Thomas's image in the family group was exactly the same size as the Frick portrait. But the exact chronological relationship between the two must remain a mystery. Holbein may have started by painting a portrait of More, and this may have spurred patron and painter to envision the much more ambitious and larger family scene. But it is equally possible that the family group was the first painting to be created, and that based on the success of that, More asked Holbein to produce a secondary single image of himself on a panel. Judging from the Basil drawing and the Nostell Priory copy, More wore the same outfit in both paintings, and the coloring of black, brown, and red against the green curtain is identical in the two works. When Erasmus wrote to the humanist Ulrich von Hutten in 1519 to paint for you the whole More as if it were on canvas, he did not know, Hans Holbein, nor could have imagined at the time that More would have sat for a portrait less than a decade later. In his letter, Erasmus commented about Thomas More. I quote, "He seems to have been born and molded for friendship, and he was its most sincere cultivator and tenacious holder." Friendship was a fundamental aspect of life for More as well as for Erasmus. The Dutch humanist had written, "Life without a friend, I think no life, but rather death." More and Erasmus were close friends, and the circle of friendship extended to a number of other humanists, including Peter Gillis. It is worth remembering that while Erasmus wrote parts of The Praise of Folly while living in More's house in London, most of More's Utopia was actually written in Gillis's house in Antwerp. The letter in Holbein's portrait that More holds in his hand is blank, and its recipient obviously unknown. but it may as well have been another scholar, a man like Erasmus or Gillis. The exchange of letters among friends and of portraits was a characteristic of humanist circles in Northern Europe at the time. Exactly 10 years before Holbein portrayed Thomas More, another painter, Quentin Massis, had painted two panels, one representing Erasmus and the other one representing Peter Gillis. The two portraits were commissioned as pendants by the two sitters who had paid together for the works in Antwerp, and both works were commissioned and intended as gifts for Sir Thomas More. Gillis is shown in his portrait holding an open letter from More, and Massis was even asked to imitate More's handwriting in the letter. Erasmus instead was portrayed wearing a ring, which was a gift from Thomas More. The two portraits reached More in Calais during his diplomatic mission in October 1517, and of course More was delighted by the gift, and even asked Gillis to send them back the original letter which Massis had copied, so that he could display the portrait and the letter together in his own collection. In honor of the painting, More even wrote an epigram feigning that the portrait had a voice. And if you remember, also the Amerbach portrait is the painting itself that speaks in the inscription. And so the composition that More writes for these two portraits says, reads, "I bear witness that Erasmus and Gillis are as dear friends as were years ago Castor and Pollux. More is said to be parted from them, though affection joins them to him as closely as anyone may be to himself. In turn, they are sad that their absent friend should miss them. An affectionate letter brings to More their inward thoughts, but I bring their outward appearances." More, while thanking Erasmus for the gift, also betrayed his own preoccupation with fame. "Let me confess, I cannot suppress one passion for future fame, which tickles my vanity whenever I recall that I shall be remembered by posterity in letters, in books, and now in pictures, as my dear friend Erasmus." Erasmus, of course, was fascinated by portraiture and used his own image as a tool for commemoration and promotion. And you will have seen a number of portraits by Holbein, but also by other artists in the exhibition upstairs. Massis also probably designed around the same time this medal of Erasmus, and an example of this is also in the exhibition. When Erasmus died, an example of one of these medals was actually placed in his coffin in Basel's Minster, and the one I'm showing you, which is in the museum in Basel, is the one that was taken out of Erasmus's coffin. Portraits of Erasmus exist in large numbers, and more than almost any other literary figure of the 16th century. In 1523, according to a letter of June 3rd of that year, Erasmus had sent two of his own portraits to England, one of which is likely to be the Holbein portrait, which was probably sent as a gift to his friend William Warham, the Archbishop of Canterbury, that you see on the left. Warham, like More, on the right, was also portrayed by Holbein in 1527, and it seems that the Archbishop sent a copy of this portrait to Erasmus. The portrait of Warham is almost identical in pose to the one of Erasmus from a few years earlier, and it seems likely that when Holbein painted it in London, he referred directly to the portrait of the Dutch scholar which he had painted 4 years before, and which he must have seen again in London in Warham's house. When discussing the military deeds of the Utopians, Raphael Hitodleus reported in More's book that if they overcome and crush their enemies by artifice and cunning, they glory in this. They proclaim a public triumph and erect a monument as if for some heroic feat of arms. Holbein's portraits of Erasmus and More, therefore, served a series of different but connected purposes. They were often part of an exchange between friends and intellectuals, but also were destined for posterity. While among friends who lived in different European countries, it made sense for them to share and send each other their portraits, the act of gift-giving implies that, like the Utopians, Erasmus, Peter Gillis, and Sir Thomas More all considered themselves worthy of being remembered and commissioned their own monuments for future generations. After 1527, and until at least 1585, we lose any trace of Holbein's portrait of Sir Thomas More. And of course, we don't know if it was painted for Erasmus, for Gillis, or for another scholar, or who it was sent to. More and Holbein, however, can be followed, obviously, after they parted ways in 1528. A year after the portrait was completed, Holbein returned to Basel. We have no evidence of the two men ever meeting again. At the time when Holbein was living in More's Chelsea household, trouble was looming in England. In 1526, the king had met Anne Boleyn, and the issue of Henry VIII's great matter was to have direct repercussions on More. The Frick portrait shows no sign of the seeds of what was going to prove a substantial chain of events for English history. It is unclear if the painter or the patron had received any news while the painting was being created that imperial troops had sacked Rome for weeks in May 1527. While Holbein was seizing Sir Thomas More for posterity, history was taking its turn. Failing to help Henry VIII to achieve the annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Cardinal Wolsey, the Lord Chancellor, had relinquished the Great Seal in October 1529, and on October 25th, Sir Thomas More was appointed Lord Chancellor of England. The pinnacle of More's career, only 2 years after the Holbein portrait had been painted, was also to mark the beginning of his fall from favor. Less than 3 years later, on May 16, 1532, More followed in Wolsey's footsteps and surrendered the Great Seal in the hands of Henry VIII at York Palace. More had failed where the cardinal had also been unsuccessful, and decided to step down rather than continue in the pursuit of something that he believed was wrong. Sir Thomas' fool, Henry Pattinson, concluded, "Chancellor More is Chancellor no more." As far as we know, the king and Sir Thomas never saw each other again. Holbein remained in Basel for the years of More's chancellorship, but the Swiss city was also deeply transformed by the Reformation, and in 1532, as More was stepping down from office, the German painter returned to London to establish himself there for the rest of his life. He reached the capital in time to witness and to be involved with the coronation of Anne Boleyn as Queen of England in May 1533. Holbein was involved with the temporary decorations for the festivities. More did not attend the ceremony. The painter's career prospered in the 1530s, working mainly for the German steelyard merchants in London and for the crown. More instead shrouded himself in silence, but it was a silence that was deafening to the king's ears. Asked to sign the Act of Succession, later transformed into the Act of Supremacy, and acknowledge the issue of Anne Boleyn as the ruling dynasty of England and Henry VIII as the head of the Church of England, More refused. He was put on trial for treason and imprisoned in the Tower of London. There, in what he termed mine own desert, he spent more than a year. On July 6, 1535, he was carried to Tower Hill, where he was beheaded. What Holbein's thought of More's beheading is not known. He only had 8 years to live himself. On November 29, 1543, he died in London, and he was still in the king's service. Sir Thomas More, the lawyer, the wise scholar, and the humanist, the witty and the honest man who stubbornly died for his principles, lives in posterity's mind through Holbein's work. The intent of More to be remembered by future generations for his action is equally embodied in this portrait. When Edward Huth lent the Holbein portrait to the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge for 5 months in 1910, only a couple of years before the painting was acquired by Henry Clay Frick and arrived in New York, the Cambridge Review reported on June 2nd, "It is indeed so noble and lifelike that it is not surprising that visitors often uncover their heads as though in the actual presence of the keen-eyed chancellor who suffered death for his principles." Thank you.